Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by Stephen Erikson and Ian Esslemont because there were some community questions about the Malazan series. So instead of me trying to dream up answers that are, wrong, I thought I would ask the two co-creators of the Malazan universe the questions. And so when they dream up answers that are wrong, at least it has some sort of weight behind it. So, hello, Cameron.
Hello, thanks for the invite, AP.
And just in case people are wondering, Cam's internet connection is a bit ropey today, which I had hoped would never happen again, but he may freeze, but we're going to work away. And hello, Steve.
Hello.
One of these days, you're going to be enthusiastic to talk to me, Stephen.
Yeah. We all live in hope.
So the first question came from Bertie Sanders 7788. How did you create the magic and come up with the limitations for the magic that makes it feel both magical and real for the entire series? So can you talk about the D&D origins or the GURPS origins and how that came together and how you adapted it to the novelizations?
Yeah, as you said, AP, the origins are well known. We start with the D&D system, and then went on to GURPS when we were playing. But all the time we were sort of messing with the mechanics because we were looking for those limitations that the questioner mentions, ways that made the costs for using power much more, the circumstances are much more dire, so to speak. The costs were higher. And we're always looking for that, ways to do it. So Steve?
Yeah. I think we, even early on, I remember I think you tried to run a game in, was it Rollmaster? Does that sound right, Cam?
That or
Pat,
similar system, something like that.
yeah, but anyway, some of those would have had the idea of backfire spells and the risks involved, I think, probably appealed to both of us. But to me, I mean, a lot of our gaming was so narrative driven. It was so story driven, that I suspect we both altered the mechanics and the effects of magic to serve the story, as opposed to just throwing them out there and then having everybody sort of adjust to the specific rules that were set in place by the game. So in other words, it was as if the Malazan world was dictating what we could do rather than the rules of magic in AD&D or in GURPS. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, I keep talking about how the mechanics, the violence that we did to to the mechanics while we were playing.
Yeah.
Because all considerations of balance, game balance, all the rest of it was just completely out the window. We were just trying to serve the story,
Yeah.
always, and the magic, system, if you will, if you can want to call it that, was at the mercy of the narrative itself.
Yeah.
Because I think that's actually a really interesting point. When a system is balanced in terms of a ludic experience. So with D&D, like you're only allowed to use X number of spells per day before you have to rest and rememorize them. And the reason it's in the ludic system is otherwise, well, I cast fireball, I cast fireball, I cast fireball, I cast fireball over and over again. You're like, how do you turn that into an entertaining game if that is just going to circumvent every single encounter? So you need a limitation on it. But the ludic experience and the narrative experience are not necessarily the same. So this idea of balance where you're balancing it more towards a story and a world that you're experiencing. And I think that's actually quite interesting because you told a brilliant anecdote and a number of times. I'm not sure if we ever recorded it, but about a mage who was an illusionist battling a demon, and it turned out that the demon was also a small imp who was an illusionist. And through that sequence, you were constantly casting more and more and more illusion spells and running away and hiding that you couldn't possibly do in the actual game according to the rules. But it it was a funny encounter. And so you can see the power of the story in that. So how, when you were translating the ludic mechanics, how did you find that balance for the narrative of a secondary world that you wanted to try and evoke?
Well, I'll start. For us, I think the aspects of the ludic experience was play. Play was extremely. It was all about having fun, enjoyment, and discovery. So we were actually learning about things as we were doing it, and the world was being created as we move forward, and what was around the next horizon was discovered through play, and many times. So the ludic experience was all just the play of it. We were playing, in if you will, just having fun, and everything was trying to extend that and serve it, and even play with what was going on. The constant reversals, and things like that. That's all building on what had just gone before.
Yeah, I think just thinking about it in a more meta aspect, I don't think it's surprising that Kellenved was an illusionist. And I think we started to explore that school of magic pretty early on. And I think we probably both realized that there are elements to, even within the game rules of D&D and GURPS, etc., there are elements in which illusion as a school of magic can basically break any game. And yet what you end up playing with is this really weird notion where you're telling a story as the GM or the DM, which is based on narrative. So you're verbalizing this story. And so you're having to describe everything in that world. Now, if you're good at what you're doing and you're playing with illusions, you can describe things that simply don't exist, but you do it with a straight face as if it's part of that same world, which can really lead the players astray because they believe everything you're telling them. So suddenly the narrative is suspect, because generally what happens is eventually it's outed. Eventually it's discovered that you've been duped by illusions throughout, part of a campaign. At which point it's like the mindset of the player changes. Now they attempt to disbelieve everything you tell them, which is its own kind of amusement for the GM. But it is a weird kind of meta thing because everything is dependent upon that narrator who's built this campaign. And once the narrator introduces illusion, it raises into question everything that narrator has to say. And that's kind of a weird dynamic, but we did it for laughs. And we were both quite capable of keeping a straight face when we were telling outright ridiculous illusions. And that's certainly the anecdote that AP mentioned was, that was Kellenved's first adventure in that abandoned keep. And it was extremely comedic. Yeah.
One of the very first. And of course, fiction itself. I mean, we're just making it all up anyway. It's all fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's why illusion as a school of magic and in all these game systems is, to me, it's the most problematic in terms of the mechanics of a game. And so you can see that what they did was they really tried to limit what you can do in illusion. But even if you're only casting spells that are visual illusions without auditory, without anything else, you can do a lot with that. And it raises into question, quite similar to what, say, Star Trek Next Generation had to deal with holograms. You know, where do you draw this line in physical reality versus light emission, given that, you know, all matter is basically light anyways, so it becomes a kind of a cloudy issue. And I think that potential is always sitting there with illusion as a school in magic.
Because I think one of the ways of approaching RPGs as games is that each sort of encounter is a puzzle to be solved. And that's a very different mindset from the narrative entertainment that a different RPG experience can be, which is about, you know, we're going to experience this story and build a story together. Both are using an RPG system, but the intention behind it can be very, very different. And if you go in with that sort of quite mechanical, here is the problem, I must now, using these tools, find a solution. Messing around with illusion magic is going to completely make that very, very difficult. You gave the example once of a very simple illusion spell where I think it was like a level 1 illusion spell. So the lock on a door, move it 1 foot to the right. And it's a really simple, straightforward illusion spell. That thief is going to break every single lockpick trying to, I just can't, this is an unbreakable lock because the lock is in the wrong place. And so they keep breaking their thieves' tools. They can't pick the lock. And yet you can imagine how, if that was viewed as a problem, the encounter that has to be solved, the person playing the thief could get very, very upset because it was such a low level spell. Or a bridge crossing a chasm and you move the bridge 5 feet to the right. So everyone goes to walk on the bridge and falls into the chasm and dies. And how can you then build a cooperative world when you cannot believe what the GM is saying, and yet the only way to build belief in the world is to listen to what the GM is describing?
Precisely.
So, yeah.
You two are mean and horrible.
Yeah,
it all comes to community, right? I mean, if you're gaming, you're building a community. And of course, for us, we were both, the key is we were both in on the joke.
Yeah.
Like, this wasn't someone victimizing someone else's credulity, you know. This was, we were both in on the joke. We were both having fun with it and enjoying it. So it wasn't an antagonistic a situation, right?
No, I still remember that game session because, yeah, it was sort of ramping up levels of absurdity. Every time you opened a door in a place, you saw something else, right?
Yeah, the same door. You open it, it's a completely different room.
Yeah, it was really funny. It was really funny.
It was really funny.
Well,
and
okay,
it could have gone on forever.
Yeah, it could have.
Let's move on to one of the other questions. Slightly more serious one. When I read Malazan, I can't help but think about the theme of existential fear of dying and questions about the existence of an afterlife. Is this theme actually there, or is this just me projecting? So both of you have written works that really delve into both the nature of religion in the world, the afterlife, what it means to die, what it means to live. Is that a very deliberate thing that you're working in, or is it an essential ingredient of literature, the human condition?
Yeah, it's there. I certainly like, I'm not. It's not a pulpit that I'm standing at and banging on, but it's a theme. And it's a very important one to, you know, as you said, to literature and human existence. It's a question that people think about and talk about. And so in my writing, at least, they are equally thinking and talking about it. It's part of life.
Yeah, it's it's the universal obsession. And it's where religion derives from, is from those questions. What happens after you die? So it's been there for a long time, and you know, there's now evidence that it's been there before we even became modern human. Um, the Rising Star stuff, Rising Star Cave in South Africa with Homo naledi, clearly these hominids were concerned, or they had belief systems regarding the afterlife uh, in terms of how they treated their dead. You know, literally the first clear evidence of deliberate internment of dead members of the group, including potentially grave goods added to these bodies. So, you know, you're talking about something that with a brain not much larger than a chimpanzee's, and yet it is, even at this point, it is engaged with the non-corporeal in some aspects. So it really is universal. And fantasy really I think it allows us to explore that in ways that, if you will, are kind of divested of real world correlates in terms of religion. And even then, to then explore religion itself from a fairly non-denominational point of view. So it's always there. It's always going to be there. And yeah, it's not an accident that there's so much of that involved in these books.
Because even the notion of religion in fantasy is one of those difficult aspects, because you know the gods exist. The idea of having faith in them, you're like, well, of course I have faith in him. I was just talking to him. He was down the road. That god walked by and stole something from this cart, probably Shadow Throne. And that is so different from the core precepts that we have, where belief in something that we cannot definitively prove. And so the translation is never going to be one-to-one. And it's fascinating that so much of fantasy has these overt, discernible, talkative, communicable gods. And then we still have holdovers from here, where you know people talk about, well, I'm a member of that, and I'm part of this faith and have faith in this god. That's always struck me as an uneasy thing in fantasy.
Uneasy.
A cleric of a certain god having a crisis of faith
Mhm.
in fantasy. You go, but what is the crisis of faith here? That you no longer believe that the god exists, or you no longer believe in the tenets of that religion. And you can see the tenets of the religion is a convincing thing, that you go, no, their focus is in the wrong place. But it can't be, you can't believe in the god, because in so many fantasy stories, they communicate directly with their god.
Sure. The crisis of faith in those instances, and I explore that a lot, is about the relationship. So it's no different from a crisis of faith in a marriage where one partner cheats. All right, there's going to be a crisis of faith in that marriage, in that relationship. All things that were originally unquestioned are suddenly questioned. And that's kind of how this is. It's not a question of whether they exist or not. It's a question of what is the nature of the relationship I have with this entity, and is it what I thought it was? Is it at all interested? Is it manipulative? Is it demanding? Is it are there any softer sentiments and emotions attached to this at all? So it's more of a ground level kind of crisis of faith, as opposed to the questions of existence versus non-existence, which to my mind is kind of it's a modern dilemma. It's not one that probably existed 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. I think that sense of the unknowable was a far more immediate experience for people living back then, and so they may not have made that distinction that we make between observable reality and unobservable effects on reality, right? So I think it was different, and I think that sort of what you're talking about is a very modern approach to these things. Cam?
Yeah, there you can also have a crisis of faith in that if you've established in say in the world Malaz, you have the gods and they're out meddling and doing things, you can lose faith in the actual individual, and you could start to question their actions and their motives, and you could think, well, gee, is this entity actually worthy of my worship?
Yeah.
Should I really be following this individual, their organization, their faith, whatever is it, doing things that I now have support for?
Yeah,
That's another crisis of faith. Yeah. But also, I want to disagree a little bit. I want to think that it's not strictly a modern question, this existential angst. I think that it does go back even to classical era, where you have a whole pantheon of gods to pick from. But there were those who were non-believers and who
sure.
were living in time, and thought that, no, I'm not going to buy into this. So questions of life, death, afterlife, it's always been there.
There you go. Two divergent opinions.
But that's why I like talking about these things, because it's always of interest, the different approaches and ways that you can think about it. Because in both of your works, we have the formation of new religions and the difference that we as reader can see between knowing the events that led to the formation of the religion and then seeing the religion at a later point and going, but that's not what happened. And thinking about our religions in the real world, even in that way of, we can understand how things become mythologized over time, how that can shape and change, and how our culture with our values reshapes a message from an earlier time. And that is part and parcel of religion evolving in fantasy worlds away from our systems that we hold dear or we hold in contempt, depending on our position.
Yeah, and it's similar. I mean, just elaborating or touching on what Cam was talking about in terms of losing faith in the, I don't know, the moral rectitude of your God, or its moral placing and its actions and all the rest. That's the other side of the same coin, in the sense that if you look at our world, quite often a lot of the holy texts are all about how you serve that God, and a reward is sort of laid out for good service. But then we have examples of the failure of that God in providing those rewards. So if you think of in the Mayan civilization, a lot of the human sacrifice, a lot of the ritual activities that were occurring were bound to bringing the rain. And when the rain stopped and drought hit in 10th century, 9th century, the religion completely collapsed because the reward system broke down. The rains did not come in response to the sacrifices made seasonally. So it does exist in both directions. And so that's one of the things that I explore the most, I think. I'm really interested in the nature of that relationship in terms of the give and take and the way that switches and can switch back and forth. And if you have an active present God that can physically manifest, that just makes it all the more immediate in terms of what the decisions will be for the worshiper versus the worshipped.
Okay. Another question here about the ancient races and the different fantasy races that you use to populate the world, where the ideas came from and how they evolved over time. So the Kachin Chamal, the Jagat, the Trail, like where were you drawing a lot of that inspiration from for these things, and how did they come to be?
Wow.
For some of the races, I think it's pretty obvious that we were drawing on our anthropological background. We have early hominids, we have evolutionary lineages. That's one aspect of the racial populating of the world. The Imas, that's Steve's, and I'd be interested in hearing what he had in mind when they first appeared.
Well, before I go there, can you remember Kachin Chamal? Because it sounds like a name I would have come up with, but doesn't mean I necessarily came up with the race itself. Because I know you created Moonspawn. I know you had a backstory to it. Spoilers here, I guess, in some respect. Can you remember? Did you partially create that reptilian species?
That may have been, but the name itself is certainly yours.
Yeah.
And I think that the origins of that goes back to D&D and gaming. So
the origin of
there
Kachin
isn't.
Chamal.
No, there isn't an actual. Well, I think of course, there are intelligent lizards and lizard races. But
there are
they're
Saurian, but the
common.
Saurian races, and now there's Dragonkin, and it's kind of evolved. But there used to be Saurian races in D&D, but they were much more hominid. So humans, but that evolved from lizards or reptiles into human-like figures. And obviously Saurian because they were warm-blooded, and then you had the reptilian ones which are cold-blooded. But you have dinosaurs with swords for arms.
Yeah,
it's a bit of an evolutionary leap there.
I suppose. I mean, well, I'll just touch on Kachin Chamal briefly. It always struck me it would be challenging to, if you weren't going to use telepathy in communication, you need some other form of communication that did not involve vocal cords as we know them. And so that's where I guess where the idea of probably from reading Edward Wilson's massive sociobiology book on the behavior of ants and the fact that ants communicate chemically. And so that sort of became a very interesting idea. Because in many respects, scent is probably far more nuanced a communication method than any other, despite what we may think. And so it seemed that kind of made sense, where because of their physiological configuration, they weren't going to be able to speak. And so we're going to have to do something else there. And so I guess I leaned into something fairly alien. But the Amass were Neanderthal. I mean, Neanderthals are one of my great obsessions, all the way through university and ever since. And it's been interesting to see how the general understanding of Neanderthal has changed just from the time I was in university. It's actually become much more amassed than it used to be, so which is pretty interesting. But that's where a lot of that came from, for sure.
Well, okay, here's a question following up on this. If the Kachin Chamal have swords for arms, how did they build anything? They don't have opposable thumbs.
They don't all have swords for arms. So in other words, you're looking
That's
at
just one class. That's just one warrior class that has that.
yeah.
But on this note, before we move on, I just saw a piece in the news. This harkens back to an earlier discussion that Steve and AP and I had about diversity, and they've just since sort of come out and said that the Iceman, the famous Iceman,
Otzi.
They figure that he was actually much darker skinned than the current representations have shown.
Oh,
So,
surprise, surprise. Yeah.
yeah, surprise, surprise.
I think most people, if we could build a time machine and go back in time, I think the vast majority of people would be shocked at how sophisticated and diverse populations were across the planet.
Yeah.
Even suppose so-called isolated areas. It's an interesting one, and I really wish we could build a time machine to go back and see a lot of the stuff. But the Jagat weren't the Jagat Edgar Rice Burroughs, was it?
Yeah, they were Tharks without the extra arms.
John Carter of Malaz. There'd be a crossover at some point.
You could do it, absolutely.
And the Tice then, I think most people would sort of point at the Tice and say they're the elves. So the light elves, the dark elves of D&D, but given very different cultures and attitudes and backgrounds.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, with some Moorcock thrown in, some Melnbonian sort of elder race sort of approach.
Which obviously Steve knows nothing about.
I never read it. I saw the book covers though.
This is one of those great things that for years you've been. I don't know why people keep pointing at Elric. It's nothing to do with Elric. I've never read Elric. And then Cam goes, "Yeah, but I did."
Yeah, he did. But you see, because I never read it, I never questioned anything that could have been derived from Moorcock, right? It wouldn't have occurred to me. I just took it as it was. So it's all Cam's fault, basically.
Yeah, it's my fault.
Were there any other? Why did you avoid the word dragon for the most part to call them Valiant?
Well, we were pulling away from all the sort of the more common terminology for things. So I mean, the closest I think we ever came to something straight out of I guess human mythology, this world's mythology, would be Trell for troll. That's about as close as we ever came. But I think I generally wanted to avoid any transference, if you will. So even the wyverns, I think we called Loki Wavile. And so we just, I mean, completely changed the language surrounding these things. Just to sort of make it more uniquely Malazan and less generic.
Well, and try and freshen it up. I mean, These are all things in the genre that have been around for a long time. And so we just wanted to give our own slant on it, our own interpretation.
Well, okay, but seeing as we brought up Moorcock, are there and Edgar Rice Burroughs, like those are obviously two major influences on some aspects of Malazan. Are there any other authors or works or films that had significant impact on either of your vision of the world or things that you wanted to incorporate into the world in the stories?
Oh yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit. The influence of authors, of Cook, and etc. And I would say Howard. The idea of that you could sort of set off and encounter a lost civilization or a dense jungle that hides secrets. Like everything had some sort of narrative worthy aspect to it that you could encounter everywhere in the world. It was a very rich world, and that's one of the things that I think I really took away from the Howard stories.
Yeah, and Leiber's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser for sure, and Carl Edward Wagner's Kane. I think a lot of the atmospheric and stylistic stuff that they were doing certainly had an influence. But then we look at things like Lion in Winter, the film, and how the narrative was, how the dialogue was so fraught and heavy. I remember us watching that in James Bay and just being blown away by it. So yeah, various things on. We watched a lot of black and white films, that's for sure. A lot of early stuff. Paul Newman in what's the Faulkner story with the barn burner?
The barn burner.
Yeah, you remember that story? That was Ben Quick was the character's name, right? And so you can see there where Quick Ben comes from, right? It's not a stretch. So yeah, I think we were watching film adaptations of some pretty major writers. So Faulkner and Hemingway for sure. We watched a lot of that stuff, and then stuff that was adaptations from plays, which sort of really sparked us in with respect to writing screenplays and going for the dialogue stuff there. Singing
the hard-boiled genre.
Yeah, Singing Detective had a huge impact because of its meta narrative, the way it slipped in and out of sort of two parallel stories. And this is a Singing Detective that's Harry or not Harry, Dennis Potter's 8 or 10 episode series, like the long one. That was just with Michael Gambon. That was just extraordinary. I think we watched that multiple times.
Well, here's a question specifically for me about the impact of Alexander Dumas, because I know that Cam designed and ran the game that part of Gardens of the Moon was based on, and then you sort of developed it. But was that because of the Three Musketeers, the book, or was it because of the film that had the comedic English actor playing Planchet and that sort of
Michael York,
comedy?
the Michael York one?
Yeah,
with Oliver Reed and Raquel Welch. That was a great series.
I forget the name of the director, but for me, that's always been the very, very best adaptation, because it was just so different and so defined. Because instead of having the usual fight fencing match where the Errol Flynn sort of approach, instead it's just people were falling and throwing things at each other, and just it was completely overturned expectations, and that was just wonderful. So I really enjoyed that adaptation. and of course the book originally, right, coming to it from having a very deep familiarity with that particular book.
Because I was curious if that that influence on Gardens of the Moon, the game, as well as Gardens of the Moon, the screenplay, and then ultimately Gardens of the Moon. Can you not come up with a different title each time? It's exhausting having to keep saying this. But whether it was the book was the major influence, whether because that film version is so definitive in my mind, and I've seen, because they keep readapting it, and each one is a different take with a different point of, but none of them I think ever went for the same action comedy
No.
that was in that version. And there are sections of Gardens of the Moon, particularly even the character of Krupp and how he interacts with the world, and Crocus falling through the clotheslines all the way down. Those things always reminded me of that comedy version, action comedy version of the Three Musketeers, rather than Dumas' novel.
I would say that's fair. That's probably the timing's probably right. For at least the script version, as having been heavily influenced by that film. And the second one, which was one of the Four Musketeers, with the screenplay by George MacDonald Fraser, the guy who wrote Flashman. Again, that opening sequence of the siege is one of the funniest things you'll see anywhere.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
they're at this so-called siege, and
yeah.
it's just so funny. But the same thing is in the Robin and Marion, that version, with Sean Connery playing Robin,
and Robert Shaw.
Robert Shaw is the sheriff, at the and it opens in the old world and on crusade, and they're besieging it's just a little broken tower, and there's like one old guy and throwing rocks at them.
They're climbing the wall too. I remember that scene. They do a climb, and it's supposed to be quickly scaling the wall and jumping over the side and all the rest, and they're too old, so they start slowing down. It's like it's this interminable crawl up the wall. It was just brilliant. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Every once in a while, these things pop into my head, and I go, I must ask you about it the next time we're chatting. I think, Steve, you and I have talked before about the Burn Sleep as a calendar reference for everything, and how in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, it slowly tails off these references to specific years. And Cam, I think you also sort of did away with very specific year references for things. Was there a particular reason for that, gentlemen?
Funny that. Oh dear. When we sort of went our separate ways, and Steve was off doing his stuff, and I went off and sort of went into academia. What happened, I think, is that the timeline also diverged, and unfortunately, and just you can, unavoidably, it's going to happen, and it happened, and we just simply fell out of alignment in our representations, and it just happened.
Yeah. I think we realized early on the error of our ways to be too specific on these things, so we just sort of melted it all down, basically.
Oh, look, it is still amusing that Burn Sleep annotates as BS.
Yeah.
See that, yeah.
But no, because I know people bring up the timeline a lot, and to be honest, I can understand, because so much of modern fantasy is written like this is the thing that happened, and it's written as if you're watching the real thing happen, and it's being documented at the time. But like I have read enough histories of the world from these, where they mention something happening, and you go, but no, that can't have happened then. That doesn't line up with that thing. And dates get bent mistyped, misremembered. Events get conflated. And so, weirdly enough, having a conflicting timeline of events is actually more verisimilitudinous in a way than the full recreation of a concrete timeline.
Yeah, I think actually Cam and I had a conversation about that quite early on, that Cam's actually far more devious than I am in this respect. That we were going to mess with the notion of history. I mean, Cam's latest act of deviousness, relates to two maps in his latest book, right? And it's just that stuff slips through. So yeah, I think we talked quite early on that we were going to throw that stuff out because we'd read enough histories to know that it's all rubbish anyway. So you can make it up as you go along.
And Cam, certainly in a lot of your books. Oh.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say this is something you deal with quite extensively in the novels of the Malazan Empire, about the fragility of the event in the past and how it is remembered or misremembered and mistranslated, and how events grow and change and different people remember different things. And you deal with that quite significantly across the novels of the Malazan Empire.
Yeah, I addressed it directly because I had to. Because when I stepped into the world, so to speak, Steve had already established. What book were you on, Steve? I don't know, was it fourth or fifth?
Third or fourth, yeah.
So I had to already a corpus that I was reacting to, where Steve's books were published, and so as I was looking at them, I was thinking, oh crap, this what I don't remember. Doesn't line up, and so I actually deliberately had to react to that and come up with something. And so my struggle, if you will, is part of that whole thematic of dealing with an existing history and thinking, well, that's not how I remember it. And
so let me get this straight. What you're actually saying is, because Steve messed up the timeline in the beginning and put in a whole lot of random things that never happened there, he created the problem, and you've been trying to fix it ever since, and he keeps messing up. That's what I heard when you were talking there.
Of course, yes, definitely.
No, yeah, that's entirely fair. Absolutely.
Well, I think on that note, gentlemen, let me thank you very much for your time. And I hope everyone else has enjoyed this as much as me. We are just sitting, chatting, and having fun. So, Steve, Cam, thank you both very, very much.
Well, thank you, AP.
Yeah, thanks.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.